There is a detail in the book of Ezra that most people pass over without stopping. Cyrus, king of Persia, has just conquered Babylon. He has issued a decree. The Jews are free. After 70 years of captivity in the greatest city in the ancient world, they can go home. And when Ezra records who actually left, approximately 42,360 people made the journey back to Judah. Stop there. By the time of the return, 3 full generations had passed since the first deportation. The Jewish population in Babylonia had grown. They had built families, businesses, networks that stretched across the empire. Scholars estimate the Jewish community in Babylon by the late 6th century numbered in the hundreds of thousands. 42,360 went home. The rest stayed, not because Cyrus refused to let them leave, not because Babylon was a prison. They stayed because Babylon had become, in a way that requires some explanation, something they did not expect it to become. Home. What do you do with that question? What life in Babylon actually was, and what God was producing in the people Israel became there, is what this documentary is about. Because the story of the Babylonian captivity is not, at its core, a story about suffering. It is a story about formation, about what God can produce from a people in the last place they would have chosen to be. This is the story of the city that held Israel captive, and what Israel became inside it. We are going to move through 5 chapters of this story. The first, the city. What Babylon looked like at the height of its power, and why no one who entered it for the first time could remain indifferent. The second, daily life. What it actually meant to live in Babylon, where Israel settled, how they worked, how they built community inside an empire that did not share their God. The third, the exile community. What happened to Israel's faith, their scriptures, and their identity during those 70 years, and why the community they built in Babylon changed everything that came after. The fourth, the archaeology. What excavations in Iraq, Germany, and museum collections around the world have confirmed about the Jewish experience in Babylon, and what the physical evidence adds to what the text already says. And finally, the 5th chapter, the question. The one this story forces every one of us to answer. Not about Israel in Babylon, about us. To understand what Israel found when they arrived in Babylon, you have to understand what Babylon was, not what it became in metaphor, not the Babylon of Revelation, the great harlot, the mother of abominations. That is a theological image that makes complete sense once you understand the real city it came from. The real city. In 570 BC, Babylon was the largest city on the surface of the earth. Its outer walls enclosed an area of approximately 900 hectares. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited in the 5th century BC, wrote about it with an awe his usual historian's restraint could not contain. He described walls so wide that 2 4-horse chariots could pass each other on top of them. He described a city of 200,000 inhabitants. He described 100 gates of bronze. He may have exaggerated some of the details. What he did not exaggerate was the scale. Babylon sat on both banks of the Euphrates, which ran directly through the center of the city. A stone bridge crossed the river, one of the earliest permanent bridges in recorded history. On the eastern bank, the royal palaces, the great temples, the administrative complexes. On the western bank, residential districts, gardens, markets. Between these 2 banks, the river, the Euphrates. The same river that Psalm 137 would describe with a grief still raw 3 millennia later. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. When you understand what those rivers actually looked like, what it meant to sit beside a river in the center of the most powerful city on earth, with every structure in that city designed to communicate that the god Marduk, not the God of Israel, was sovereign over the world. The grief of that psalm begins to make sense at a different level. The entrance to Babylon's ceremonial core was the Ishtar Gate. It stood approximately 14 meters high and was covered entirely in brilliant blue and turquoise glazed bricks. Not painted, glazed. The technology required to produce this color uniformly across tens of thousands of bricks was, in 600 BC, unmatched anywhere in the world. No other civilization on Earth could do this. Across the surface of the gate, 2 animals in alternating rows, the aurochs, a massive extinct species of cattle, and the Mushusu, the dragon of Marduk, depicted with a serpent's head, an eagle's talons, and the body of a scaled predator. Every Israelite deported to Babylon entered the city through this gate. They would have walked through it in chains. Beyond the gate ran the processional way, a road nearly a kilometer long, lined on both sides with glazed lions, each one crafted in yellow and red against blue. This was the route of the statue of Marduk during the Al-Yahudu festival, the Babylonian New Year, when the entire city gathered to celebrate the victory of their god over chaos. The message was not subtle. Walk down this road, look at the lions, remember who rules this world. At the far end of the processional way stood the Etemenanki. The Etemenanki was a ziggurat, a stepped temple tower, dedicated to Marduk. It rose approximately 90 meters into the sky, 7 tiers, each smaller than the one below, culminating in a temple at the summit, accessible only to the priests. Most scholars believe the Etemenanki is the structure behind the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. The name in Sumerian means house of the foundation of heaven and earth. The Babylonians did not intend this as arrogance. They understood it as cosmology. This tower was the point where heaven and earth met. The God of Israel had a different view of that claim. And the Israelites who arrived in Babylon in chains, who had grown up reading Genesis 11, who had been taught from childhood that this city's foundational theology was a rebellion against the God who scattered its builders, they would have looked up at the Etemenanki and understood immediately what they were standing inside. The empire of the God who tried to reach heaven, and the God of Israel had sent them here. The Jewish exiles in Babylon were not kept in prison camps. This is important to understand and easy to miss if you read the word captivity and assume it means what it sounds like. Nebuchadnezzar's deportation policy followed a well-established Mesopotamian tradition. You removed a conquered people from their land, which neutralized their capacity for rebellion by separating them from their agricultural base, their sacred sites, and their national identity. And then you resettled them in regions of the empire where their labor and skills were useful. The goal was integration, not extermination. Jeremiah's letter to the first exiles, recorded in Jeremiah 29, reflects exactly this policy. He writes from Jerusalem, "Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." This was not a letter of consolation. It was a strategic instruction. God was not telling Israel to forget Babylon. He was telling them to invest in it. And that is, to a significant degree, what happened. The primary settlement area for Jewish exiles in Babylonia was a region called Al-Yahudu. The name in Akkadian means City of Judah. It was a network of agricultural settlements located in the region of Nippur, south of Babylon proper, along the irrigation canals fed by the Euphrates. Al-Yahudu was not a ghetto. It was a functioning community with its own governance, its own economy, and its own records. We know this because those records survived. More on that in the Archaeology chapter. What the records show is a Jewish community engaged in Babylonian economic life at every level. They farmed land allotted to them by the crown in exchange for tax payments and military service obligations. They entered commercial contracts. They borrowed and lent money. They appeared as witnesses in legal documents. The Jewish men in these documents carry names that tell their own story. Some maintain Hebrew names, Yahu names, names that contain the divine name of God, Neriah, Gedaliah, Benaiah, names that their parents gave them in Jerusalem, names that carried within them the memory of a God whose temple had burned. Others have Babylonian names, or both. This is the quiet history the text does not fully narrate, the daily negotiation of identity that every exile community in every era has had to conduct. What do you keep? What do you adapt? Where is the line between survival and assimilation? Babylon itself was a cosmopolitan city unlike anything Israel had encountered. The markets operated in multiple languages. Aramaic, which would become the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, largely because of Babylonian commercial dominance, was the language of trade. Akkadian was the language of the royal court. Sumerian was still used in religious contexts. Into this environment came Hebrew-speaking Judahites, alongside Egyptians, Elamites, Medes, and peoples from across the empire. There was a banking system. There were commercial houses. The most famous, the Ajibi family, operated for several generations, managing deposits, making loans, and conducting transactions in silver across the empire. The Babylonian banking houses used documents that functioned like modern promissory notes. They understood compound interest. The agricultural productivity of Mesopotamia, fed by an extensive canal system the Babylonians had been developing for centuries, made Babylon one of the most food-secure cities on Earth. Dates were the staple crop, grown in massive groves along the riverbanks, processed into date syrup, date wine, date cakes. Grain was abundant. Fish from the Euphrates were preserved and traded. Nothing in the text of Ezekiel or Daniel suggests Israel was starving in Babylon. What they were was displaced. And displacement at the level of culture and identity and theology is not hunger. It is something harder to name and harder to endure. Because everything in this city told a different story. Every gate was dedicated to a different god. Every festival celebrated a different cosmology. Every brick, as Henry Rawlinson noted after examining nearly 100 ruined cities in the region of ancient Babylonia, had Nebuchadnezzar's name stamped on it, the man who had burned the temple of their god. And yet, here they were, alive, fed, working, building, and being formed. Something happened to Israel in Babylon that is, when you think about it carefully, almost impossible to explain without the theological framework Jeremiah and Ezekiel were trying to give them. Before the exile, Israel had worshipped idols. Not occasionally, not marginally, generationally, persistently. The books of Kings document king after king who did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, who permitted or actively promoted the worship of Baal, of Asherah, of Molech. Ezekiel, writing from Babylon, laid out the indictment in terms so specific they are uncomfortable to read. He described idolatry being conducted inside the temple itself. 70 elders of Israel in a secret chamber, burning incense to images carved on the walls. This was the state of Israel's spiritual life immediately before Nebuchadnezzar arrived. Now here is what happened after. In Babylon, Israel stopped worshiping idols, not gradually, not eventually. The Jewish community that returned from Babylon 70 years later was never tempted by idolatry in the same way again. The rabbis of the Second Temple period would later say that the evil inclination toward idolatry died in Babylon. The same people who had burned incense to Asherah while the temple still stood came out of Babylon as the most fiercely monotheistic community in the ancient world. What changed? The test of faith that Babylon represented was simple and devastating. Was the God of Israel actually God? Or had Marduk won? The answer that Israel came to in Babylon was worked out not in a moment, but over decades of living in the presence of the most comprehensive alternative theological system in the ancient world. And the answer they arrived at was the one the prophets had been trying to give them all along. Marduk had not defeated God. God had used Marduk's representative to discipline his people. Ezekiel understood this from inside Babylon. Daniel understood it from inside the royal court. And somewhere in the space between those two locations, between the farming settlements of Al-Yahudu and the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, Israel began to do something they had never done with the same intentionality before. They gathered their scriptures. The books that would become the Hebrew Bible were preserved, organized, and transmitted in Babylon. The Torah, the historical books, the prophets, much of what we read today passed through the hands of scribes in Babylonian exile. The tradition that would eventually produce the Masoretic text, the authoritative Hebrew Bible that underlies most modern translations, has its roots in this period. They also began to gather in ways that did not require a temple. This is where the synagogue begins. Not in Judah. In Babylon. The word synagogue comes from the Greek, but the institution, a gathering of the community for prayer, reading, and teaching without sacrifice, without a priesthood, without a physical sanctuary, emerged in exile, where none of those things were possible. Ezekiel 8:1 records him sitting in his house in Babylon with the elders of Judah sitting before him. That is a synagogue, not a building, a gathering, a practice, a way of maintaining the community's relationship with God when everything that had previously mediated that relationship was gone. The synagogue would outlast the Second Temple, outlast the Roman Empire, and carry the worship of God through every subsequent diaspora, every scattering, every persecution, every forced migration for the next 2,500 years. It was born in Babylon. Where Israel went as a nation defined by land and temple, it would come back as a community defined by text and practice. A community that could survive anywhere because it carried its center with it. And that transformation began in the last place Israel would have chosen to be, beside the rivers of Babylon. For a long time, what we knew about the Jewish experience in Babylon came almost entirely from the biblical text: Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, the Psalms, Ezra, and Nehemiah. These sources were internally consistent. They aligned with what was known from Babylonian records about deportation practices and the administrative methods of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But physical evidence of the Jewish community itself, not in Jerusalem, not in Judah, but inside Babylonia was sparse. That has changed. The most significant discovery relating to the Jewish exile in Babylon is a collection of approximately 200 cuneiform tablets, known as the Al-Yahudu tablets. They surfaced on the antiquities market in the 1990s and early 2000s, and have been studied extensively by scholars Laurie Pierce and Cornelia Wunsch, whose analysis was published under the title Documents of Judean Exiles and West Semites in Babylonia. What do these tablets contain? Administrative and commercial records, lease agreements, tax documents, records of debt and payment. They are dated, the earliest to the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, around 572 BC, and the latest to the Persian period under Darius I, around 498 BC. Nearly a century of records from a single Jewish community in Babylonian exile. The names in these documents are among the most remarkable things they contain. Yahoo names appear throughout, names incorporating the divine name of the God of Israel. Yahu Natan, Yahu Azir, Shama Yama. Names that are linguistically Hebrew, written phonetically into Akkadian cuneiform. These were not the names of people who had forgotten their God. They were the names of farmers settling their accounts at the end of a growing season. Ordinary transactions, the kind of paperwork that accumulates in any functioning community. But the paperwork survived. In clay, which is what papyrus can never claim. One tablet in the Al-Yahudu collection records a legal transaction involving a man named Gedaliahu, son of Neriah Ilu, a name that appears to correspond to Gedaliah, son of Neriah, a figure mentioned in the book of Jeremiah. The tablet is dated. The dates align. We cannot claim with certainty that these are the same people. The names were common enough, but the names appear in the same region, in the same period, in a community that the text tells us was there. The text has names. The clay has the same names, in the same century, in the same place. Beyond the Al-Yahudu tablets, the broader physical picture of Babylon comes through the excavations of Robert Koldewey, who worked at Babylon from 1899 to 1917 for the German Oriental Society. Koldewey excavated the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, and the southern palace of Nebuchadnezzar. The Ishtar Gate itself was transported to Berlin, where it was reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum, where it stands today, still blue, still covered with the dragons and bulls of Marduk, still 14 meters high. If you want to stand in front of what the Jewish exiles walked through when they entered Babylon, you can. You fly to Berlin. You go to the Pergamon Museum, and you stand in front of a gate that has not moved significantly in 2,600 years. One more archaeological layer deserves attention. In the 5th century BC, a full century after the first deportation, well into the Persian period, a family of Jewish merchants in Nippur produced what scholars call the Murashu Archive. Nearly 700 cuneiform tablets documenting 3 generations of a Jewish commercial family operating within the Persian administrative system. These are not exiles in crisis. These are businessmen. 3 generations deep in Babylonian society, running commercial operations that involved land leases, canal rights, and sophisticated financial instruments. Many of the names in the Murashu archive are Babylonian names. Their grandparents had Hebrew names. Their children have Babylonian names. And yet the family is identifiable as Jewish by name patterns, by association with other known Jewish families, by the network of relationships the tablets document. This is what 3 generations of exile looks like in the physical record. Not persecution, integration. And in that integration, a question. Were they still Israel? The answer, as it turns out, is yes. But the Israel that came back was not the Israel that left. When Cyrus issued his decree in 539 BC, Ezra records that approximately 42,360 people chose to make the journey back to Judah. The rest stayed, and both things, the return and the staying, were part of God's answer. Those who returned rebuilt the temple. They restored the sacrificial system. They reconstituted the Levitical priesthood. They built the community that would eventually produce the Second Temple period, the Pharisees, the scribes, John the Baptist, and, in the fullness of time, the world into which Jesus of Nazareth was born. Those who stayed became the Babylonian Jewish community that would, in the 5th and 6th centuries AD, produce the Babylonian Talmud, the most comprehensive document of Jewish law and theology ever written. The Talmud that Orthodox Jewish communities around the world study today. Both came from Babylon, the returning community and the remaining community, the rebuilt temple and the Babylonian Talmud. The Levites who sang in Jerusalem and the rabbis who wrote in Mesopotamia. All of it came from the city God had sent them to. Now consider what had to be true for that to happen. The God who sent Nebuchadnezzar had to know what Babylon would produce in Israel. He had to know that the city of Marduk, the city whose founding mythology was a rebellion against the God of Genesis 11, would become, in the hands of his providence, the place where his people learned to carry their faith without a temple. He had to know that before Babylon could produce the return, it had to produce the exile. Jeremiah describes it with a clarity that does not soften for the sake of comfort. He's writing to a community that has just been deported 700 miles from their homes. He is writing to people who have just lost everything, and he says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." Jeremiah 29:11. Read the context. The future and the hope are not instead of Babylon. They are not around Babylon. They are through it. This is what the city that held Israel captive actually was. Not a detour from God's plan. Not a tragedy that God recovered from. The plan. And that changes the question entirely. Before you walk away from this story, there is a question it leaves on the table. Not about Israel and Babylon, about us. We have all had a Babylon, a place we did not choose. A season that felt like captivity, not because we were in chains, but because everything in our environment seemed designed to tell us that what we believed was wrong. That the world worked differently than we had been taught. That the God we trusted was either absent or indifferent. A difficult marriage. A career that collapsed. A diagnosis that arrived without warning. A loss that did not resolve the way faith said it should. And in those places, the same question that Babylon asked Israel, it asks us. Is God still sovereign here? Or did something else win? The exiles who sat by the rivers of Babylon and wept, they were not weak for weeping. The psalm does not rebuke them for it, it records it. There we sat down and wept. Grief in the Bible is not the opposite of faith. It is often the most honest form of it. But here is what Babylon produced in the people who stayed faithful through it. It produced a community that no longer needed a temple to worship. It produced a people who could carry God with them into any empire, any language, any century. It produced the capacity for faith that is not dependent on favorable circumstances, because they had learned that God's purposes do not require favorable circumstances. They require only a people willing to remain His in whatever place He sends them. Jeremiah said it before any of them boarded the carts heading east. I know the plans I have for you, not plans for your comfort, not plans for your immediate restoration, plans for your future, plans for your hope, but the future runs through Babylon. That is not a comfortable sentence. It is not meant to be, because the God who sent His people into the city of Marduk, the God who tried to reach heaven, did not do so because He had lost control. He did so because He knew something Israel did not yet know about themselves. That they were capable of becoming, in the hardest place on earth, exactly who He needed them to be. And He may know the same thing about you. So, before you ask God to remove the Babylon you are in, before you pray one more time for the door to open, for the situation to change, for the season to finally end, ask a harder question. What is He producing in me here that could only be produced here? Because the people who came home from Babylon did not come home unchanged. They came home as the community that would carry the Scriptures through the next 5 centuries. The community that would build the synagogues. The community into which, in the fullness of time, a child would be born in Bethlehem. The exile did not interrupt the story of redemption. It was part of it, and so, very possibly, is yours.